Just got a quick question. Do you know where I can find the Rock of Chickamauga? All right, thank you very much.
On the morning of September 20th of 1863, the fighting at Chickamauga continued. During this fighting, General William Roscrans, the overall Union commander, thought a gap had opened up in the Union line. To fill this gap that didn't exist, Thomas Wood's division was moved from their position near the Brotherton cabin. As the last of Wood's men were vacating their positions, Confederate General James Longstreet would launch his attack straight into this newly formed gap. At approximately 11 a.m., 8 Confederate brigades totaling nearly 11,000 men advanced forward, routing numerous Union units. Nearly one-third of the Union Army was swept away, including their overall commander, William Roscrans.
Our lines now emerged from the forest into open ground on the border of long open fields, over which the enemy were retreating under cover of several batteries. General Bushrod Johnson.
But not all was lost for the Union just yet. Small remnants of shattered Union units began to reform along a small hill that was home to George Washington Snodgrass. It was here that the Union Army decided to make their stand.
We are currently walking along a position that would be known as Snodgrass Hill, and this area would essentially start becoming a refuge to shattered Union units who were routed near the Brotherton cabin. Will these units be able to formulate any sort of defense to slow down the Confederate onslaught? Let's find out. So we are currently positioned along a place called Snodgrass Hill, and this area was originally occupied by Union artillery and a handful of Union infantry that was essentially here just supporting General George Thomas's flank. Now, following the breakthrough near the Brotherton cabin, shattered Union units from Brannan's division, Negley's division, and Van Cleve's division began to rally here in this area. And just to give you a snapshot of just how devastated a lot of these units were, the 44th Indiana was only able to account for 40 men here in this general area. So that means you had hundreds of men unaccounted for beyond this wood line here. And that just shows you how devastating the Confederate attack was on September 20th of 1863. So we are standing in the general area where Colonel Charles Harker would position his brigade. Now, originally this field would have been covered in corn. So Harker would position his brigade right here manning this ridge here. And we are currently standing where the 125th Ohio Volunteer Infantry, commanded by Colonel Emerson Updike, who is a very competent commander. Now, later on in the war, he would command a brigade, and he'd be credited for helping save the Union line at Franklin. And the 125th Ohio, known as Updike's Tigers, would have manned this line here, and it was a waiting game now. These men knew that a Confederate attack was imminent. They just had to reach this location. So just imagine what was going through the minds of these men, knowing that beyond these trees were thousands of Confederate forces bearing down on this location. And in this general area was just shattered remnants of what used to be Union units. Now, once Harker's men were positioned here, he essentially told them they had to hold this position at all costs. The Union troops knew that they were on the verge of utter destruction here, and the longer they can hold out, the more men they can save. So right here before us, like we just stated, is Emerson Updike's Tigers. And that's why you have the tiger on top of the monument. It's a pretty neat monument too. So right here, the 125th Ohio Volunteer Infantry, known as Updike's Tigers, would have been positioned, and the first Confederate units to attack this area were South Carolinians under the command of Joseph Kershaw, and his men would have swept through Dyer Field in this direction here and advanced up these subtle slopes here. Now, it may be hard to tell, but we're on some high ground, obviously, and it kind of slopes down right into here. I don't know how many trees were here at the time of the battle, but This first attack by Kershaw's South Carolinians was repulsed with relative ease. Now, we mentioned a little bit earlier in the video that this area was essentially a cornfield, and this corn helped conceal some of the Union troops here. So imagine being a South Carolinian advancing, you have all the momentum in the world, and Union troops appear out of the corn and start delivering volleys into your ranks. And the fight for Snodgrass Hill, or I should say for the survival of the Union Army, was started here.
You must hold this position at all hazards.
We will hold this ground or go to heaven from it.
Now, Kershaw's men weren't the only men assaulting this portion of the Union line. A brigade of Mississippians would begin advancing towards this general direction, where they would be hit with heavy fire from Union artillery that was perched on the hill here. And before the attack even began, Humphreys would pull back his Mississippi brigade, and in turn, another attack was repulsed here as the Union forces continued to organize some sort of defense here. Just wanted to give you another view of the terrain here. So you have another Union artillery position. I'm panning to my left where you would have had Kershaw's brigade of South Carolinians along with another Mississippi brigade advance through this general area. And panning back to my left, you had Harker's brigade and elements of Hazen's brigade and a couple other artillery batteries holding this ridge here. And then panning back to my right, you can kind of see the strong position that the Union was beginning to occupy here. And their position ran all up this road, and that's where we're going to be headed next. Now, before we move on down the line, this artillery piece here caught my eye. I believe it's a Napoleon, but what I noticed is the barrel is depressed down. And I want to see the field of fire that this gun would have possessed with its barrel in its current location. And what you were seeing is just a clear killing field for this artillery piece. And you can almost imagine this thing belching hot iron and lead towards Kershaw, South Carolinians here. And just imagine the canister skipping off the ground into the ranks. And it's always interesting to see the muzzle positions of some of these cannons here. And this one is just depressed down, just waiting to deliver death. Now, this area was inhabited by George Snodgrass and his family of 9, and they built their home here. And unfortunately for them, the second day of the Battle of Chickamauga, they found themselves right in the thick of some of the heaviest fighting of the war. And the Snodgrass cabin here began filling with wounded Union soldiers here. Now, as you can see from the exterior, it's not a very big cabin. So imagine once the fighting started breaking out here, and this was commandeered as a field hospital, imagine dozens and dozens of men just sprawled out all over the exterior of the cabin, inside. And once the Union pulled back from this location, they couldn't take all their wounded. And following the battle here, the Snodgrass cabin acted as a field hospital for both sides. And there was just littered with wounded Union and Confederate troops here. And as you look inside of it, you know, you're seeing, bring it in the focus a little more, it probably can't effectively hold more than just a handful of men. And it's hard to imagine this cabin just being littered with dozens and dozens of men from both sides, all with various wounds here. And it just goes to show you the people that lived here, although not densely populated, people that lived in this area before the battle were also impacted by this battle here. And as we make our way around the Snodgrass cabin here, the front line is right there. There is no safety here, even if you were wounded. In this area, the mini balls would have been thick through the air. I'm sure there's numerous bullet strikes to the cabin. Maybe some of the wounded men are getting hit in the cabin and around the cabin. It's just an awful scene that's unfolding right here for this family. So we're making our way down the Union line here, but I wanted to stop here because it offers a pretty good visual of the Union position here. So right through these trees, you can see the Snodgrass cabin there. Panning to my right, you have more of the Union line here, and I want to show you the position that they command here. And just look down at this strong position that they now occupy. And you can see it's just straight down. So you can imagine the Union troops along the ridge here just pouring lead down into the oncoming Confederate forces. And every minute that the Union troops delay the Confederate attack is more men saved for the Union Army. So it's important to remember when Longstreet broke through near the Brotherton cabin, about a third of the Union Army and Major General Roscrans himself, the commander of the Union Army here, they fled to Chattanooga. So it was up to George Thomas to organize a defense and save what he could of the Union Army here. So we're making our way down Horseshoe Ridge, and we're going to stop at a part of the Union line that actually saw a brief Confederate breakthrough. But before we head there, I'm trying to put myself in the shoes of General George Thomas. Think about at 1 second you're in charge of just your corps on one portion of the line, and the next thing you know, a third of the Union Army in the field is gone, and the overall commander of your force is gone. And now it's up to you to organize a defense and save the Union Army from complete and utter destruction here at Chickamauga. And it amazes me how the Union was able to hold out as long as they could and be as organized as they were. And think about, this is a time where you can't just radio someone for help. This is, you have riders riding back and forth, and you're getting information at a much slower rate, and still they were able to hold out and save a large bulk of the Union force. Now, I'm a bit surprised about the terrain here when you're seeing it in person. I knew this area was obviously a bit of high ground, but I didn't realize it would be this aggressive. So the Union line would have been to my right and my left, but look at some of the terrain here. And it's just essentially funneling the Confederate attackers right up into the muzzles of the Union infantry here. So they were right along this line here, panning back to my right, continuing down Horseshoe Ridge. And outside of the foliage and the trees here, it is just straight up and there's really no cover. Kind of reminds me a little bit of Culp's Hill, where you have some foliage, but there's really nowhere to hide. And they were assaulting straight uphill after having advanced hundreds of yards already. So that definitely helped the Union cause here. So we worked our way down Horseshoe Ridge here. We came from this direction here, followed the trail here, and at one point in the battle here, the 21st Ohio was the extreme right flank of the Union Army. And like we mentioned a little earlier, Kershaw's South Carolinians were one of the first brigades to attack the Union positions here. So they sent up some skirmishers in this general direction, and they were met by withering fire from the Union forces here. Now, something that's interesting about the 21st Ohio here is they were sporting Colt revolving rifles. So their firepower was greatly enhanced by those weapons. And instead of your single shot muzzle loaders, they were able to fire multiple rounds into the oncoming Confederate forces. Now, something else that's interesting with the 21st Ohio, after this initial contact, they obviously drove back the South Carolina Brigade. Well, the 21st Ohio thought that they were going to take advantage of the South Carolinians pulling back, and they launched a countercharge down the slopes here into the South Carolinians. But unfortunately, Joseph Kershaw was a very experienced commander, and he established a fallback line. So his men were waiting for the Ohio men here, and he dropped scores of Ohioans as they met Kershaw's reserve line. And the 21st Ohio was forced to pull back and man their location here.
Colonel Bland, then Major Hard, commanding the 7th, were killed. Lieutenant Colonel Hoole of the 8th was killed. Colonel Gist, commanding the 15th, and Captain Jennings, commanding the 3rd Battalion, were dangerously wounded, while many others of the line had fallen, and men were being mown down like grain before a sickle. Augustus Dickert, 3rd South Carolina.
So I've worked my way down a bit, and I just kind of wanted to show you the advance through the eyes of the Confederates as best I can. So the 21st Ohio was positioned just through the foliage here. So Kershaw's brigade would have been advancing from this direction here, moving up towards the 21st Ohio. And then, like we touched on, you had the 21st Ohio lead a countercharge back into Kershaw's men in this general direction here, and eventually they would be forced back to their original position just beyond the ridge here. And as you can see, as we get closer back to the ridge, you can truly see the commanding position that the troops manning this area would have had despite being outnumbered. And panning back down, and you can see we were just in that area there. So just to kind of put things in perspective for you, I find that the topography really helps piece the battle together. So I've worked my way down from the Union line, and we are, I guess, in the general area that would have been between the lines. So to orient you, you have Dyer Field is in that general direction. So Kershaw's men would advance through this area, moving to the right, and come through this general area here. So here's their tablet, and I'm going to walk down just a little bit so we can maybe get a glimpse of the Union positions here. So Kershaw's tablet is right here, and I worked my way down a little bit so you can maybe at least get a glimpse of what the terrain is like here. So they would have been advancing through this general area, and the Union works were just beyond that. So like we stated, you had Kershaw's men come up, they were repulsed. They essentially formed a defensive line somewhere back in this area, and then the 21st Ohio came bearing towards our position here, and they were repulsed. So you had the South Carolina Brigade advancing through this area numerous times and attacking the Union positions just ahead here. But this is just a snapshot of their perspective here. So after Kershaw drove back the Ohioans, he would launch another assault, coming through this way, moving right to left, and assaulting the 21st Ohio's position here. Now, at some point in the fighting, a man by the name of Sergeant Richard Kirkland of the 2nd South Carolina, who was dubbed the Angel of Maurice Heights, as the story goes, he jumped over the stone wall at Fredericksburg and began tending to wounded Union soldiers, offering them water. And from then on, he was dubbed the Angel of Maurice Heights. Well, he was involved in the action here. Remember, Longstreet's corps was shifted from the east to the west, and Kershaw's brigade was part of that. And at some point, Sergeant Richard Kirkland and 2 other men were separated from their unit. The fighting was pretty intense here. And as Kirkland was beginning to pull back, he turned to fire one more shot at the Union soldiers here, and he would be mortally wounded just out in front of the Union lines here, somewhere in this general area here. So again, Kirkland was coming up with 2 other soldiers, realized they were a little too far out front of his men. He began to pull back, stopped, raised his rifle to fire another shot, where he was struck mortally wounded. And it is said that Kirkland's last words were, "Tell my pa I died right." So the Angel of Maurice Heights would be mortally wounded just before us in this location.
At first, the charging Johnnies, reaching the proper distance and receiving a volley from the regiment, returned the same, and then started on the keen jump, expecting to reach us before we could reload. Before they advanced 10 paces, they would get another volley. And while they were pondering upon the circumstance, still a third, then they would scarcely get their backs turned before a 4th would catch them. And on a dead run, the 5th came singing about their ears. Lieutenant William Vance, 21st Ohio.
Here they were, armed with their repeating rifles. They met us with such a terrific fire that we were compelled to fall back over the brow of the hill for protection. There was a breeze passing through the woods, blowing the yellow leaves from the trees. In my mind, I compared those fallen leaves to the fallen men on that battlefield. John Cox, 2nd South Carolina.
Now I worked my way a little farther down the line, and I came across the 2nd South Carolina Regiment. So we just touched on Richard Kirkland, who was a member of the 2nd South Carolina. And just to give you a little more of an accurate location, at some point during this attack, Sergeant Richard Kirkland was advancing through the woods here, where he was struck and mortally wounded. And his regiment would have been right here in this area here. Now, the 21st Ohio Monument is just through the wood line here, about 50 yards. So it's a little further down on the 21st Ohio's right flank. Now, despite their superior position, these Confederate attacks were taking a toll on the Union defenders here. They were running low on men and they were running low on ammunition. And some Confederate units were able to overlap the 21st Ohio and make some high ground here and began pouring fire into their flank. Now, the 21st Ohio is positioned right here. We're elevated on some high ground, and they began shooting into the right flank of the 21st Ohio. But just like a scene from the movie, Gordon Granger's Reserve Corps appears right here and drives the Confederate forces back from this position. So we're looking at the 21st Ohio Monument, and just in the nick of time, Gordon Granger's Reserve Corps, who began marching this way towards the sound of the guns, would arrive, and fresh Union infantry would be taking the field. And not only did this drive back the Confederate gains in this area, it extended the Union line further down in this direction and in turn enhanced their defense. So now you had regiments like the 22nd Michigan, the 40th Ohio, the 89th Ohio who was manning this area. You had those regiments who were fresh, and they came into line of battle here in this general location and prolonged the fight for Horseshoe Ridge.
It was now nearly night when the lines having given way on both right and left of us, we were subjected to an enfilading fire of shot, shell, and musketry, thus flanking us, so that we were forced to turn our line. But we rallied again and charged again, driving them back. Captain David Barrett, 89th Ohio Infantry.
Now, the fighting that started here around 1 p.m. would continue up until almost nightfall. And at some point during the fighting here, General George Thomas received orders from Major General Roscrans to pull back his forces and formulate a defense around Rossville Gap. Well, Thomas began pulling back his forces, and this portion of the line never received those orders. So you had the 21st Ohio, the 22nd Michigan, and an interesting note about the 22nd Michigan here is within their ranks was the drummer boy of Chickamauga, Johnny Clem. And you had the 89th Ohio manning this general area here. Well, those orders to pull back never reached this location. Now, I've read that the courier that was sent to this area was killed before the message could be delivered. And I've also read that these 3 units were just sacrificed in the name of saving the majority of the army here. So come nightfall, a majority of the Union Army was pulling back, and you have 3 lone regiments holding this area here. And just below, you have thousands of Confederate forces readying for one final attack. So in one final push, come nightfall here, these 3 regiments were quickly overrun. You had Confederate forces overrunning this position from the front. You had Confederate forces who worked their way around the Union position here, and now they were essentially attacking from this direction here. You had Trigg's mixed brigade containing some Florida regiments and a Virginia regiment. They came through this area and essentially cut off the escape of the 89th, 21st Ohio, and the 22nd Michigan. And we mentioned a little earlier that the 21st Ohio, down this way, had Colt revolving rifles. And once they were about to be captured in one final act of defiance, they took the cylinders from those rifles and began hurling them into the woods so that these rifles could not be used against their friends who were now miles away from this location. I thought that was pretty interesting.
A terrific fire was poured into us from front and flank, and in a few minutes we stood there endeavoring to return the fire. About 1/3 of our brave fellows went down, killed or wounded. Our lieutenant colonel was shot through the foot and ankle. The whole color guard was shot down, 4 or 5 of them killed. All this during the 10 to 15 minutes we tried to hold the position. Lieutenant William Hamilton, the 22nd Michigan.
Gosh, I'm really trying to envision what it would have been like to be a soldier within the 22nd Michigan, the 89th Ohio, the 21st Ohio, being left alone here, knowing that there is thousands of Confederate forces essentially surrounding us, and we're running low on ammunition. how many of your friends aren't with us anymore, and still, these men were sacrificed for the greater good of the Union Army. I know that's easy to say because we're not the ones within the ranks of these 3 regiments, but a large portion of the Union Army was saved here because of the actions on Snodgrass Hill and Horseshoe Ridge. And the same army that was defeated here at Chickamauga would go on and defend Chattanooga. After 3 days of savage fighting that created over 34,000 casualties, the Battle of Chickamauga was finally over. When it's all said and done, the fight here at Chickamauga would become the second costliest conflict of the American Civil War, ranking only behind Gettysburg. I hope you've enjoyed this series, and I hope you've learned a thing or two about Chickamauga, because, like I always say, coming to these fields and learning their stories and bringing these stories to life, there's really no better way to learn about our history. Thanks for watching, and like I always say, we'll catch you on the next one.